The morning sun barely penetrated the thick clouds. Over the North African desert, as Captain James Morrison wiped the sand from his goggles, 7 P-40 Warhawks sat on the makeshift airfield, their shark-mouthed nose art gleaming. Despite the dust that seemed to cover everything, in this forsaken place, Morrison had studied the intelligence reports 3 times already. That morning, 30 German Messerschmitt fighters were expected to escort a bomber formation, heading toward Allied positions. 7 against 30, the odds were brutal. But Morrison and his squadron had developed something the Germans wouldn't expect. If you're enjoying this story of courage and tactical brilliance, please hit that like button and subscribe to our channel for more incredible historical narratives that bring the past to life. Morrison gathered his pilots in the shade of a worn canvas tent that flapped in the persistent desert wind. The fabric was patched in dozens of places, testament to the harsh conditions they endured daily. Lieutenant Danny Chen, the youngest of the group at 22, nervously tapped his flight gloves against his thigh. He had arrived in North Africa 3 months ago, fresh from training, eager and terrified in equal measure. His first combat mission had been a baptism by fire, and only Morrison's quick intervention had saved him from a Me-109 that had gotten on his tail. Since then, Chen had grown from a nervous rookie into a capable pilot, but the fear never completely left. It just became something you learned to manage, to control, to use. Sergeant Mike O'Brien, a former factory worker from Detroit, stood with his arms crossed, his weathered face showing the strain of 6 months in the desert. O'Brien had been building cars before the war, honest work that paid decent money and let him support his wife and 2 kids. When Pearl Harbor happened, he'd enlisted the next day, much to his wife's horror. He'd shown an aptitude for flying that surprised everyone, including himself. The skills that made him good at assembling engines translated well to maintaining and understanding aircraft. He could feel when something was wrong with his Warhawk, could hear the subtle changes in engine tone that meant trouble. This intuition had saved his life more than once. Captain Sarah Winters, one of the few female ferry pilots who had talked her way into combat duty, leaned against a fuel drum, her green eyes fixed on Morrison. Winters' story was unique in the squadron. She had been ferrying aircraft from factories to bases. Boring but essential work that kept her far from combat. But she'd badgered, pleaded, and pulled every string she could find, until someone finally gave her a chance to prove herself in combat. Her first mission had silenced the skeptics. She'd shot down 2 German fighters and brought her Warhawk home, despite significant damage. Now, 6 months later, she had 7 confirmed kills, and the respect of every pilot in the squadron. She'd earned it the hard way, proving herself every single day. The others, Lieutenants Frank Weber, Antonio Rodriguez, and Sergeant Jim Taylor, formed a semicircle around their commander. Weber was the oldest at 34, a veteran of the early days of the war, who had flown in France before the evacuation. He'd seen the Luftwaffe at their peak, understood their tactics intimately, and brought that hard-won knowledge to every mission. His face bore scars from a crash landing 2 years ago, permanent reminders of how quickly things could go wrong. Rodriguez had grown up in rural Texas, the son of immigrant parents who'd worked themselves to exhaustion to give their children a better life. He flew with a quiet competence, never flashy, never taking unnecessary risks, but always there when needed. His calm voice on the radio during combat had talked more than one pilot through moments of panic. Taylor was the mechanic's dream, a pilot who understood the technical aspects of their aircraft better than most engineers. He could diagnose problems by sound, could coax extra performance from engines that should have quit, could bring damaged aircraft home through sheer understanding of what the machine could and couldn't do. His Warhawk was the most reliable in the squadron, not because it was newer or better, but because he maintained it with an almost obsessive attention to detail. The wind picked up, sending small dust devils dancing across the airfield. Morrison spread a hand-drawn map on a crate. His finger traced a line through the desert landscape. The plan was unconventional, born from desperation and observation. Traditional dogfighting tactics wouldn't work. The Messerschmitts were faster, more maneuverable at high altitude, but the Warhawks had advantages the Germans underestimated. Chen spoke first, his voice tight with tension. Captain 30 fighters. We're going to need more than luck. Morrison looked at each pilot in turn. The heat was already oppressive. Even at this early hour, sweat stained their flight suits. He understood their fear. He felt it too. A cold knot in his stomach that had been there since the briefing at dawn. O'Brien cleared his throat. The Warhawks can take a beating. We know that, but can we dish it out fast enough before they swarm us? Morrison nodded. That's exactly what we're counting on. The P-40s were built like tanks. Their armored cockpits and self-sealing fuel tanks had saved countless pilots. But more importantly, they could dive faster than almost any fighter in the sky. Winters straightened up, understanding dawning in her expression. You want to use the boom and zoom. Morrison smiled grimly. Not just that. We're going to make them chase us where they don't want to go. Rodriguez raised an eyebrow. The deck Morrison confirmed with a sharp nod. We're taking them to the desert floor. The strategy was dangerous, carrying risks that Morrison had calculated, but couldn't entirely mitigate. At low altitude, mistakes meant instant death. There was no room for error. No altitude to trade for speed. If things went wrong, no margin for judgment calls. A moment's hesitation, a miscalculation of distance, a misjudgment of speed. Any of these could turn a pilot into a smoking crater in the sand. But the ME-262, designed for high-altitude combat over Europe, where the air was thin and cold, would lose their performance advantage in the thick, hot air close to the ground. Their superchargers, optimized for altitude, would provide less benefit. Their cooling systems, adequate at 20,000 feet, would struggle at 500. The Warhawks, with their powerful Allison engines and robust cooling, would be in their element, fighting the kind of battle they were designed for. Morrison had spent weeks developing this strategy, studying after-action reports from dozens of engagements, analyzing the strengths and weaknesses of both aircraft types. He'd spoken with mechanics about engine performance, with aeronautical engineers about wing loading and power-to-weight ratios, with survivors about what had worked and what hadn't. The tactical concept had come to him during a sleepless night, watching the stars wheel overhead, thinking about physics and psychology and the nature of aerial combat. Weber, the most experienced pilot after Morrison, studied the map with the intensity of a man who understood that details mattered, that the difference between life and death could be measured in seconds. And feet we split into two elements, he said, thinking through the implications. Morrison agreed, pleased that Weber had immediately grasped the plan's essential structure. Chen, O'Brien, and Rodriguez. You're with me, we're the bait. It was a role that required nerve, the willingness to appear vulnerable, to invite attack while trusting completely, that your wingmates would execute their part flawlessly. Winters, Weber, and Taylor. You're the hammer, Morrison continued. We draw them down, you hit them from their six when they're focused on us. The hammer element would need discipline, the ability to wait, even as they watched their squadron mates being chased. The patience to strike at exactly the right moment. Too early, and the Germans would see them coming too late. And the bait element might be overwhelmed. The afternoon sun blazed overhead as the pilots performed their pre-flight checks, a ritual that had become second nature but never routine. The metal skin of the Warhawks was almost too hot to touch, radiating heat that made the air shimmer. Ground crews worked frantically, their hands protected by heavy gloves as they loaded ammunition belts, the brass cartridges catching the light. Each aircraft carried nearly 2,000 rounds. 600 pounds of ammunition that would be expended in less than a minute of sustained fire. They checked fuel levels, using dipsticks to verify that tanks were full, knowing that every gallon might make the difference. They tightened cowling panels with torque wrenches, checking for proper tension, ensuring that nothing would come loose in the violence of combat. Every rivet, every bolt could mean the difference between life and death, between an aircraft that held together under stress and one that came apart in midair. Chen climbed into his cockpit, his hands shaking slightly as he fastened his harness. He thought about his family back in San Francisco, his mother's last letter tucked in his jacket pocket. She had written about the garden, about his little sister's graduation, about ordinary things that seemed impossibly distant now. He forced the thoughts away. Focus, survive. Get home. O'Brien settled into his seat with practiced ease. 6 months of combat had turned the nervous factory worker into a calculating fighter pilot. He'd shot down 4 German planes, each victory marked on his fuselage, but he'd also watched good men die, seen parachutes that never opened, fighters that exploded in midair. The desert had taken friends. The sky had claimed brothers. He gripped the control stick, feeling its familiar weight. Morrison's voice crackled over the radio. "This is Hawk Leader, start engine 7. Allison of 17. 10 engines roared to life, their combined thunder echoing across the airfield. Black smoke belched from exhaust stacks. The propellers carved the air, creating miniature dust storms. Morrison felt the Warhawk come alive beneath him, a living thing of metal and fury. They took off in pairs, wheels leaving the packed earth, climbing into the hostile sky. The formation tightened as they gained altitude. Morrison kept them at 8,000 feet. Lower than usual, he wanted altitude advantage for the dive, but not so high that the Germans would have their full performance envelope. The radio crackled, Hawk Leader. "This is Sandstorm Control Bandits inbound. Bearing 095, altitude 2030 plus contacts." Morrison's grip tightened on the stick. "Hawk Squadron acknowledge." 6 voices responded in sequence. His heart pounded against his ribs, adrenaline sharpening his senses. The sky ahead was deceptively peaceful, a vast blue expanse broken only by scattered clouds. But Morrison knew what was coming. He'd faced the Luftwaffe before, knew their tactics, their aggression, their skill. The German pilots were professionals, many with dozens of kills. They wouldn't make this easy. Chen spotted them first bandits. 11 as o'clock high. Morrison saw them too, dark specks against the clouds growing larger. The Messerschmitts flew in a loose formation, confident, predatory. They had the numbers, the altitude, the speed, everything except knowledge of what was about to happen. Morrison's voice was calm, despite the fear churning in his gut. "Bait element on me. We're going down." He pushed the stick forward, diving toward the desert floor. Chen O'Brien and Rodriguez followed, their Warhawks screaming through the air. The Germans took the bait, immediately peeling off, to pursue what appeared to be retreating American fighters. The desert rushed up to meet them. Morrison leveled out at 500 feet. The sand and rocks a blur beneath his wings. The Warhawks kicked up dust trails, racing across the wasteland at maximum speed. Behind them, the Me-109s followed, diving from their perch, expecting an easy kill. But at low altitude, the dynamics changed. The hot desert air, the reduced engine performance, the proximity to the ground, all factors that favored the rugged Warhawks over the sleek German fighters, the Me-109s, built for the cold, thin air of high altitude, began to struggle. Winters watched from above as the Germans committed to the chase. Her element had stayed high, circling like hawks, waiting for the perfect moment. Now it came hammer element attack. She rolled inverted and pulled through, diving nearly vertical Weber and Taylor on her wings. The Germans never saw them coming, focused on the 4 Warhawks ahead. They didn't check their 6. Winters lined up on the trailing Me-262. Her gun sights centered on the fuselage. Her fingers squeezed the trigger. 650 caliber machine guns erupted, tracers arcing across the sky. The German fighter shuddered under the impact, pieces flying off, smoke pouring from the engine. Ribber and Taylor opened fire simultaneously, catching 2 more Me-109s in a devastating crossfire. The neat German formation disintegrated into chaos. Pilots broke in all directions, trying to gain altitude, trying to escape the trap they'd flown into. Morrison pulled back on the stick, trading speed for altitude. In a climbing turn, Chen stayed glued to his wing. A Messerschmitt flashed past, the pilot's face visible for an instant. Eyes wide with surprise, Morrison reversed, using the Warhawk's superior turning ability. At low speed, the German tried to dive away. But O'Brien was there, guns blazing. The sky filled with smoke and tracers, a chaotic symphony of destruction that defied comprehension. Aircraft twisted and turned in a deadly ballet, each pilot fighting for every second of survival. The air temperature at low altitude made everything harder. Engines ran hotter, performance degraded, and the margin for error shrank to nothing. Morrison had counted on this. had studied the performance charts, until he could recite them from memory. The Warhawks engine, built for durability over refinement, handled the heat better than the highly tuned Messerschmitt power plants. Rodriguez found himself on the tail of a Me-109. But another German fighter was lining up on him. The enemy pilot was good, anticipating Rodriguez's moves, cutting inside his turn. Rodriguez could feel the situation deteriorating, the geometry of the engagement working against him. His hands moved instinctively, years of training compressed into microseconds of decision. He broke hard left the Warhawk's airframe groaning under the G-forces. The enemy's bullets stitched the air where he'd been seconds before, so close he could hear them crack past his canopy. Sweat poured down his face, stinging his eyes, his breath coming in gasps. As the G-forces pressed him into his seat, Chen's calm voice cut through the chaos. A lifeline in the maelstrom. "I've got him, Rodriguez." Chen had been watching, had anticipated the threat, had positioned himself perfectly. It was the kind of situational awareness that separated the survivors from the casualties. He'd learned to read the battle, to see patterns in the chaos, to know where threats would emerge before they materialized. His gun spoke the familiar hammering, vibration running through the airframe. The German fighter trying to kill Rodriguez burst into flames, pieces of cowling and canopy flying off in the slipstream. The pilot's parachute deployed moments later, the white silk stark against the desert sky. Chen didn't watch him float down. There was no time for contemplation, no luxury of reflection. Another threat, another target, another split-second decision. Taylor's Warhawk took hits, the distinctive sound of cannon shells punching through aluminum. Impossible to mistake red hydraulic fluid sprayed across his canopy, obscuring his view, the acrid smell filling the cockpit. Despite his oxygen mask, his controls felt sluggish. The aircraft wanting to roll right, fighting him every second. He fought it with raw muscle, his arms burning with the effort, refusing to give up, refusing to accept what seemed inevitable. A Messerschmitt swooped in for the kill, the German pilot probably already counting this as a victory. But Winters was faster, had been watching. Her wingman had positioned for exactly this scenario. Her experience showed in every move, every calculated burst of gunfire. She didn't spray and pray like a rookie. Every pull of the trigger was deliberate, conserving ammunition, making each round count. The German broke off, trailing smoke. His attack run aborted, his confidence shaken. O'Brien lined up on a Messerschmitt. That had made the fatal mistake of trying to turn with him at low altitude. The German pilot was skilled. Morrison could see that in the way he handled his aircraft, the smoothness of his maneuvers, but skill couldn't overcome physics. The Warhawk's tighter turning circle at low altitude gave O'Brien the advantage he needed. He walked his tracers into the enemy fighter, a technique that required perfect trigger discipline, and an understanding of ballistics that came only from experience. He watched as the canopy shattered, glass fragments glittering in the harsh sunlight. The aircraft rolled over, seemed to hang in the air for a moment, then dove into the sand below, the impact sending up a column of dust and debris. The battle continued with relentless intensity. Every pilot was pushed to their limits and beyond. Chen found himself thinking in ways he never had before, his conscious mind barely keeping up with decisions his instincts made. He saw threats and opportunities in the same instant, processed options faster than thought, acted without hesitation. This was what all the training had been for. Those endless hours of practice, the simulated dogfights, the lectures on tactics and energy management. It all came together now in this crucible of fire and metal. Reba's engagement with the seasoned Luftwaffe pilot became a duel of experience and skill. The German had hundreds of hours of combat time. Morrison could tell from the way he flew. Every move was efficient, economical, designed to conserve energy while bringing guns to bear. He caught Weber in a climbing scissors maneuver, a complex series of vertical turns, designed to get inside the opponent's turn radius. Weber saw it developing but couldn't prevent it. His Warhawk shuddered as cannon shells tore through the tail section. The impacts like hammer blows. Alarms screamed in his cockpit. Red lights flashing across his instrument panel. Oil pressure dropping, hydraulics failing. Rudder response degraded, he kicked the rudder hard. Skidding sideways, the German's next burst, missing by inches, holes appearing in his wing. Where his aircraft had been a heartbeat before, Morrison saw Weber's predicament. With the clarity that came from constant awareness of his squadron's position, he'd been tracking every aircraft, friendly and enemy, building a mental picture of the battle that updated continuously. He reversed his turn, cutting across the sky at an impossible angle, his Warhawk protesting with every structural member. The airframe wasn't designed for this kind of stress, but Morrison knew exactly how far he could push it. The G-forces pressed him into his seat, his vision narrowing to a tunnel, gray creeping in at the edges. He fought it, tensing his legs and core, forcing blood to his brain, maintaining consciousness through sheer will. The German pilot saw him coming and made his own split-second decision. Experience told him to break off to live to fight another day. But perhaps pride, perhaps the heat of battle, perhaps simple bad judgment made him try for the kill first. Oh, it was the wrong choice. Morrison's guns hammered the Me-109, the concentrated firepower of 6 heavy machine guns, devastating at close range. Armor-piercing incendiaries tore through the German aircraft's relatively thin armor, finding fuel tanks, hydraulics, control cables. The Me-262 came apart in stages, the left wing folding up the canopy, blown away by internal pressure, the aircraft transitioning from controlled flight to tumbling wreckage. In less than 2 seconds, the German formation was completely scattered. Now individual fighters tried desperately to escape, to gain the altitude that would give them back their advantage. But the Warhawk pilots their blood up. Their tactics proven gave them no quarter. Every time a Me-26 tried to climb, a Warhawk was there diving from above, guns blazing. Chen found himself in a head-on pass with a German fighter, both aircraft hurtling toward each other at combined speeds, exceeding 600 miles per hour. His training screamed at him to break off, but instinct kept him on course. At the last possible second, both pilots' fire tracers crossed in midair. Chen felt impacts along his fuselage, heard the metallic banging of bullets striking armor plate, but his rounds found their mark too. The Messerschmitt's engine exploded, and the German pilot barely had time to jettison his canopy before Chen flashed past missing collision by feet. Rodriguez's ammunition counter dropped towards 0. He'd been firing in controlled bursts, but the intensity of the fight had consumed his ammo faster than expected. He had maybe 10 seconds of firing time left. A Messerschmitt presented itself damaged and slow. Trying to limp away, Rodriguez made a decision. He closed to point-blank range so close, he could see the individual rivets on the German's fuselage. One long final burst, the Me-262 came apart. The pilot, bailing out his parachute, blossoming against the desert sky. Winter's tactical mind kept track of the battle. Even as she fought her own engagement, she counted 15 German fighters down or fleeing, another 8 trying to reform, and 7 still actively engaged. The mathematics of aerial combat favored them. Now she called out targets, coordinating the squadron with calm precision. Taylor nursed his damaged Warhawk through a diving attack on a Me-109 that had fixated on O'Brien. The controls fought him every second. The damaged hydraulics, making every maneuver an exercise in brute force. But he got the shot, his remaining ammunition tearing into the German's wing root. The Me-262 rolled inverted in dove, the pilot making no attempt to recover. The remaining German fighters, recognizing the disaster, broke off and ran. They climbed desperately, using their speed to open the distance. Morrison considered pursuing, but made the tactical decision to let them go. His squadron was low on fuel and ammunition. Pushing their luck further could turn victory into tragedy. Hawk Squadron, form on me. Morrison's voice was hoarse from shouting commands and breathing hard during high G maneuvers. The 6 surviving Warhawks assembled in loose formation. Morrison did a quick count. All 7 aircraft had made it through damaged. Shot up, but flying the flight back to base was tense. Weber's tail section was barely holding together, pieces of metal flapping in the slipstream. Taylor's hydraulics were failing, his landing gear questionable. Chen had taken hits to his engine cowling, oil pressure fluctuating dangerously. But they stayed together, a battered but unbroken unit. The airfield appeared on the horizon, and Morrison had never been so happy to see that dusty strip of land. He called the tower Sandstorm Control. Hawk Leader, 7 aircraft returning. Request emergency landing for Hawk 4 and Hawk 6. The response was immediate. Cleared for straight-in approach. Fire crews standing by Weber landed first. His Warhawk touching down gently. Despite the damage, the tail section groaned ominously. But Held Taylor came in next. His landing gear deploying at the last possible moment. One wheel hanging at an odd angle. He set the aircraft down with practiced skill. The damaged gear holding just long enough before collapsing, sending the Warhawks sliding down the runway in a shower of sparks. The rest of the squadron landed without incident. As Morrison climbed from his cockpit, his legs nearly gave out, the adrenaline was wearing off, leaving exhaustion in its wake. Ground crews swarmed the aircraft, assessing damage, counting bullet holes, shaking their heads in amazement. The intelligence officer arrived within minutes. Notebook in hand, Morrison made his initial report. 7 Warhawks against 13 Mi-109s, estimated. 15 enemy aircraft destroyed. 8 damaged, 7 fled. 0 friendly losses. The officer stared at him in disbelief, then began taking detailed statements from each. Pilot Chen sat on the wing of his Warhawk, hands still shaking from the adrenaline. He counted 23 bullet holes in his aircraft, including 3 that had struck the armored seat back. Directly behind his head, 3 inches higher, and he wouldn't have made it home. He pulled out his mother's letter, now creased and sweat-stained, and read it again, the ordinary words more precious than ever. O'Brien walked around his aircraft with the crew chief, examining the damage. The Warhawk's rugged construction had saved his life multiple times. Armor plate had stopped rounds that would have killed him. Self-sealing fuel tanks had prevented a fire. He patted the fuselage affectionately. This machine that had become his partner, his protection, his lifeline. Winters found Morrison near the operations tent, both of them staring at the setting sun, painting the desert in shades of orange and red. She broke the silence. That strategy of yours. It worked, Morrison nodded slowly. This time we got lucky. They took the bait. Winters disagreed. It wasn't luck. You read them perfectly, knew they'd be overconfident. Knew they'd chase. Morrison thought about the German pilots, who hadn't made it back to their base. Young men probably like his own squadron, skilled. Brave but caught in a tactical situation that negated their advantages. War reduced everything to numbers. To advantage and disadvantage, to who made the right decision. In a split second, he felt no triumph. Only a grim satisfaction that his people had survived. The debriefing lasted hours, stretching into the evening as the sun set over the desert. Every detail of the engagement was recorded, analyzed, discussed with an intensity that matched the battle itself. Command wanted to understand how 7 fighters had defeated a force 4 times their size. This wasn't just victory, it was something unprecedented. A tactical achievement that could change how fighter squadrons approached combat. Morrison explained the tactics with the precision of an engineer. But the passion of a warrior? The use of altitude and speed. Understanding that energy management in aerial combat was everything. The advantage of the Warhawk at low level, where its rugged construction and powerful engine gave it characteristics the German fighters couldn't match. The coordination between the bait and hammer elements. The timing that had to be perfect. The trust that each pilot had to have in the others. He drew diagrams on a blackboard, recreated the engagement from multiple perspectives, walked the intelligence officers through each decision point. Weber, his arm, bandaged from a piece of shrapnel that had penetrated the cockpit, hitting him, even through the armor that had saved his life from worse injury, added his perspective. The Messerschmitts expected us to run or to fight on their terms. They'd fought American fighters before, knew the typical tactics, the standard responses. When we brought them down to the deck and hit them from 2 directions, they lost cohesion, lost their numbers advantage. The formation they'd relied on became a liability. When pilots started breaking in all directions, when mutual support became impossible in the chaos. Rodriguez spoke about the psychological aspect, with insights that surprised even Morrison. They thought they were hunting, he said, his voice steady. Despite the exhaustion, didn't realize they were being hunted until it was too late. That moment of confusion when predator realizes it's become prey, that's when we hurt them the most. The hesitation, the doubt, The moment when training and instinct collided. That was when the battle was really won. The kills were just confirmation of what had already been decided. In those first crucial seconds, Taylor, limping from a hard landing that had tweaked his ankle badly, emphasized the importance of aircraft maintenance with the fervor of a true believer. My Warhawk took a beating, but kept flying. He said, pride evident in every word. 23 hits, 3 of them cannon shells. Hydraulics, shot to hell, rudder barely responding. And she still brought me home. The ground crews, they're the real heroes. Without their work, without them going over every rivet, every bolt, every cable, we don't come home, they don't get the glory. Don't get their names in the reports, but every pilot in this squadron owes them their lives. Multiple times over. The intelligence assessment would later confirm the squadron's claims, though the process would take weeks. Reconnaissance photos showed the wreckage of German fighters, scattered across miles of desert. Some impacts so violent that identification was nearly impossible. The Luftwaffe had lost not just aircraft, but experienced pilots irreplaceable in this stage of the war. Every German fighter pilot took months to train. Thousands of flight hours to develop the skills needed for combat. Each loss was a blow to the German war machine that couldn't be easily recovered. The engagement became a case study. The tactics disseminated to other squadrons facing similar odds. Morrison's unconventional approach would be studied in training schools, analyzed by tacticians, incorporated into doctrine. That night, the 7 pilots gathered informally, in a space between 2 aircraft revetments, a location that had become their unofficial meeting place. Someone had acquired a bottle of whiskey through mysterious means, the kind of contraband that appeared and disappeared in military units. Without anyone asking too many questions, they shared it in small sips. More ritual than indulgence, knowing they might fly again tomorrow. They didn't talk about the battle, an unspoken agreement that seemed to form naturally. Instead, they talked about home, about families, about what they do after the war. If there was an after, Chen described his mother's garden in San Francisco, the way she grew vegetables between the flowers, practical even in beauty. He talked about the smell of jasmine in the evening, the fog rolling in from the bay, the sound of cable cars on steep hills, simple things that seemed impossibly distant now, ordinary moments that had become precious through their absence. His father had died when Chen was young, and his mother had raised him alone, working multiple jobs to give him opportunities she'd never had. Becoming a pilot serving his country. It was his way of honoring her sacrifice. O'Brien talked about the Detroit auto plants, the smell of welding and steel, the satisfaction of building something tangible with your hands. He'd grown up in that world, where men measured their worth by their ability to create, to provide, to endure. The factory had been loud, hot, dangerous work, but it had been honest. He missed that honesty sometimes, missed the simplicity of problems that could be solved with the right tool, and enough effort war was messier. More ambiguous victories that felt hollow even as you celebrated them. Rodriguez spoke of Texas sunsets. The way the sky would turn colors that seemed impossible. Reds and purples and golds. That painted the landscape in hues no artist could match. He talked about his wife, about how they'd met at a church social, about how she'd made him work for 3 months, before agreeing to their first date. She was strong, stronger than him in ways that mattered. She held their family together while he was gone, managed their small farm, raised their daughter. Never complained in her letters, even though he knew she was terrified every day that he might not come back. Winters mentioned the mountains of Colorado, the peaks that stayed snow-capped even in summer, the thin air that made everything seem sharper. Cleaner she'd learned to fly in those mountains, learned to respect weather and altitude, and the unforgiving nature of mistakes. Her father had been a pilot too, barnstorming in the 20s, dead in a crash before she was born. Her mother had forbidden her from flying, terrified of losing her daughter, the same way Winters had defied her, driven by something she couldn't fully explain. A need to touch the sky that was stronger than fear or common sense. They'd reconciled eventually, but the wound had never fully healed. Morrison listened more than he spoke, understanding what this ritual meant. The need to remember who they were beyond the killing, beyond the war. They were people who had been thrust into impossible situations, and had survived through skill, courage, and brotherhood tomorrow, they might fly again. Might face death again, but tonight, they were just 7, people who had looked into the abyss and made it back, who had stared down odds that should have killed them, and emerged victorious through planning, execution, and a refusal to accept the inevitable. The moon rose over the desert, casting silver light across the airfield. The Warhawks sat in their revetments, battered but ready. Ground crews worked through the night, repairing damage, replacing parts, preparing the fighters for whatever came next. The sound of rivet guns and welding torches echoed in the darkness. In the operations tent, Morrison studied reconnaissance reports and weather forecasts. The war continued. There would be more missions, more battles, more impossible odds. But they had proven something important. They had shown that superior tactics and determination could overcome numerical disadvantage. They had shown that the Warhawk, often underestimated, was a formidable weapon in the right hands. Chen couldn't sleep. He walked out to the flight line. Found his aircraft. The shark mouth painted on the nose grinned in the moonlight. He climbed onto the wing, sat in the cockpit without starting the engine. This cramped metal space had been his world for the last 6 months. Every gauge, every switch, every control was intimately familiar. He wondered how many more missions, how many more battles before he could go home. O'Brien found him there an hour later, unable to sleep himself. They sat together in comfortable silence. 2 men who had faced death together and understood what that meant. Finally, O'Brien spoke. "You did good today, kid." Real good, Chen nodded. "We all did," O'Brien agreed. "Yeah, we all did." Winters walked the perimeter, a habit from her training days. She thought about the battle, replaying each maneuver in her mind, analyzing what worked, what could have been better. The hammer element had performed perfectly. But they'd gotten lucky too. If the Germans had spotted them earlier, if their leader had been more cautious, the outcome could have been very different. War was like that, a combination of planning and chance, skill and fortune. Rodriguez wrote a letter to his wife describing the landscape, the weather, the mundane details of desert life. He didn't mention the battle. She worried enough already. Instead, he wrote about the friends he'd made, about how the squadron looked out for each other, about how he was being careful, the lies we tell to protect those we love. He thought, sealing the envelope. Weber examined his damaged aircraft in the harsh work lights. The crew chief shook his head. "We can fix it, but it'll take 3 days. Maybe 4, Weber nodded. "Do what you need to do, make her right." The chief smiled, always to Captain. "Always do." Taylor sat with the medic, getting his ankle wrapped properly. The landing had wrenched it badly, but nothing was broken. The medic worked efficiently. "You should be grounded for a week." Taylor laughed. "You know, that's not going to happen." The medic sighed. "Yeah, I know, but take it easy, okay? Try not to crash for a few days." Taylor promised nothing as dawn approached. Morrison gathered his thoughts for the after-action report. He'd submit to command. 7P-40 Warhawks had engaged 30 Me-109 fighters, using unconventional tactics, designed to negate the enemy's advantages. The strategy relied on understanding the aircraft's strengths, the environment, and human psychology. The results spoke for themselves. But Morrison knew the real story wasn't about tactics or kill ratios. It was about 7 people who trusted each other completely, who executed a dangerous plan without hesitation, who fought together and survived together. That was the real secret. The thing that couldn't be reduced to a report or a tactical manual. Brotherhood trust. The absolute certainty that your wingman would be there when you needed them. The sun broke over the horizon, painting the desert gold. Another day in North Africa. Another day of war, the Warhawks would fly again. Their pilots ready, their tactics proven. Somewhere out there, the Luftwaffe was recovering from yesterday's loss, planning their own revenge. The dance would continue. The deadly ballet of aerial combat that had no end in sight. Morrison walked to the operations tent for the morning briefing. His pilots would be there soon. Tired but ready, they learned something important yesterday. They learned that impossible odds weren't really impossible. If you had the right plan, the right people, and the courage to execute when everything was on the line. 7 against 30, they'd made it work. They'd made it home, the war would go on for years more. Though none of them knew exactly how many. Many battles lay ahead, some victories. Some losses, some draws, where survival itself counted as success. They would lose friends, would watch good pilots die in flames, or disappear into the desert without a trace. They would experience fear so profound it became part of their DNA. Moments of terror that would haunt their dreams decades later. But they would also experience moments of transcendence, times when skill and courage and luck aligned to create something approaching grace. This day, this battle would stay, with them forever. The Day 7 Warhawks turned the tables on 30 Nazi fighters with brutal strategy, superior tactics, and unbreakable spirit. They had written their names in the record books, earned citations and commendations, become examples that others would study. But more importantly, they had written themselves into each other's hearts, forged bonds that no distance or time could break. Morrison would survive the war, return home to a quiet life, teaching at a university, sharing his knowledge with students who could never fully understand what he'd experienced. He would wake sometimes at night, hearing engines, seeing tracers, reliving moments when death had missed him by inches. But he would also remember the faces of his pilots, the way they'd trusted him completely, the way they'd executed his plan without hesitation. Leadership, he would tell his students, wasn't about giving orders. It was about earning trust, so complete that people would follow you into hell itself. Chen would make it home to San Francisco, would finish his education, would become an engineer, working on the very aircraft that had saved his life. He would marry, have children, and never tell them the full truth of what he'd done, what he'd seen. Only in his final years would he begin to speak about it, sharing stories with his grandchildren, trying to explain what it meant to be 22 and facing 30 enemy fighters, knowing the odds going anyway. O'Brien would return to Detroit, but not to the factory floor. The war had changed him, given him skills and confidence he'd never known he possessed. He would start his own business, build it into something substantial, employ the kind of workers he'd once been. But he would never forget the lesson of that day, that sometimes the impossible was just another word for something that hadn't been done yet. Winters would fight for years after the war, to be recognized for her contributions, facing discrimination and dismissal from people who couldn't accept that a woman had fought and killed in aerial combat. She would eventually write a book about her experiences, become a lecturer and advocate for women in aviation. The battle over North Africa would feature prominently, proof that skill and courage had no gender. Weber would struggle more than the others. The physical wounds healed, but the psychological scars went deeper. He would have good years and bad years, times when he could function normally, and times when the memories overwhelmed him. But he would never regret his service, never question the necessity of what they'd done. He'd seen evil, had fought it, had helped defeat it, that meant something. Rodriguez would go home to Texas, to his farm, to his family. He would work the landrace cattle, live a life that seemed mundane compared to aerial combat. But he would treasure that mundanity, would find peace in the routine of seasons and harvests. He would attend squadron reunions when he could, would treasure the letters that arrived occasionally from his old wingmates, would smile when he heard aircraft overhead. Taylor would become a test pilot, unable to give up flying, addicted to the adrenaline and the challenge. He would push experimental aircraft to their limits, would contribute to aviation advancement in ways that saved countless lives. He would die eventually in a crash testing a new design, going down fighting to save data that would prevent future accidents. It was his squadron mates would say at his funeral, exactly how he would have wanted it. Years later, when they were old men and women, they would gather occasionally and talk about that day in the desert. The details would blur, the fear would fade, but the pride would remain. They had been tested in the crucible of combat, and had not been found wanting. They had faced the odds and emerged victorious, not through luck or chance, but through skill, determination, and the bond they shared. The ground crews finished their work as the pilots assembled for briefing. 7 Warhawks sat ready on the flight line, their engines silent, but their presence powerful. They were just machines, metal and rivets and fuel, But in the hands of these pilots, they had become something more. They had become instruments of victory, symbols of defiance, proof that heart and mind could overcome raw numbers. Morrison began the briefing, his voice steady, professional. But his pilot saw something else in his eyes. A respect, a recognition of what they had accomplished together. They had been ordinary people, thrust into extraordinary circumstances. They had risen to the challenge. They had prevailed, and tomorrow they would do it again.